My sister, who ignored me for 15 years, suddenly moved into my house when I got diagnosed with cancer and started planning my funeral. When the doctor said stage 2 breast cancer, the first person I called was my husband, Robert, who was traveling for work. The second was my business partner, Lisa. The third was my teenage daughter, Amy. I didn't call my sister, Veronica. We hadn't spoken properly in 15 years beyond polite holiday texts. She'd made it clear when I started my consulting firm that she thought I was getting too big for my britches, that our parents would be ashamed of me putting career before family, that real women stayed home with their children. She lived 3 hours away with her husband and acted like I didn't exist. But somehow she heard about the diagnosis through our cousin and showed up at my door with 2 suitcases the next morning. Said she was here to help. That family takes care of family. That I needed her whether I admitted it or not. I was too shocked from the diagnosis to argue, and honestly thought maybe she actually wanted to help. The first week she cooked and cleaned, which was helpful during chemo. But then she started making changes. Threw out all my food and bought what she called healing foods. Canceled my housekeeper saying she'd handle it. Told my daughter Amy that she'd be doing her homework in the kitchen now so Veronica could supervise. Changed the passwords on my streaming services because I needed to focus on recovery, not television. By week 2, she was answering my phone. Telling clients I was too sick to work. Telling friends I wasn't up for visitors. She set up a Caring Bridge page with updates about my declining condition, even though I was responding well to treatment. Posted photos of me sleeping during chemo with captions about brave battles and limited time. People started sending condolence cards. Actual sympathy cards like I was already dead. My husband Robert tried to intervene, but she told him he needed to prepare for the worst. That men didn't understand these things. That she'd seen this before with her friend's cousin who died within months. She started going through my closet saying Amy might want some things to remember me by. Packed up my jewelry in boxes labeled for Amy's wedding someday. Took photos of every room in case we needed to sell quickly after. She actually said after. Not if. After. The breaking point came when I overheard her on the phone with my biggest client. She was explaining that I wouldn't be returning to work and they should probably find a new consultant. That she was helping transition my accounts. That my partner Lisa could handle some things, but really the company would need new leadership soon. She'd already talked to a buyer about purchasing my half of the business. I was sitting right there in the next room, working on my laptop, feeling relatively fine besides some fatigue, and she was selling my life off piece by piece. Then I found the folder. She'd left it on the kitchen counter. Inside were funeral home brochures, cemetery plots she'd visited, an obituary draft that talked about my brave battle and loving family, a list of my assets with her name as executor, power of attorney documents with signature lines highlighted. She'd even picked out an urn, a pink one because I'd worn a pink shirt to chemo once. She'd planned my entire death while I was still walking around making breakfast. That afternoon, she called a family meeting without telling me. Invited my husband, daughter, and business partner to discuss transition plans. Started talking about how we needed to be realistic about timeline. How I should focus on making memories in my remaining time. How she'd handle all the difficult decisions so I could have peace. Lisa looked at me confused because she'd just seen my scan results. They were good. The tumor was shrinking. The oncologist was optimistic. But Veronica was talking like I had days, not years. That's when I stood up and told everyone to look at me. Really look at me. I wasn't dying. I was fighting cancer and winning. My hair was growing back. I was working full days. I'd run 3 miles that morning. My doctor said the prognosis was excellent. But Veronica had been so eager to play the grieving sister, the family savior, that she'd forgotten I was still alive. I pulled out my laptop and showed them the emails she'd sent from my account telling clients I was too sick to continue. The messages to Amy's school saying I couldn't participate anymore. The form she'd submitted to my insurance claiming I was terminal. The GoFundMe she'd started without telling anyone using photos from my first chemo session when I looked my worst. She'd raised $12,000 for my final expenses while I was in the next room doing yoga. Veronica tried to say she was just being prepared. That denial wasn't helpful. That someone had to be practical. That's when I pulled out the document. It was a notarized power of attorney form with my signature on it, except the signature wasn't mine. The document was dated 2 weeks ago when I'd been at my worst after a really rough chemo session. Veronica's name was listed as having complete control over my medical decisions, my finances, my estate, everything. There was a witness signature from someone named Bianca Holloway, who I'd never heard of in my life. I held the paper up so everyone could see it, and then pulled out my driver's license and held them side by side. The signatures didn't match at all. Mine had a specific loop in the M, and my last name always slanted slightly upward. The one on the power of attorney was completely different, more rounded. The letters all the same height. Robert's face went completely white as he stared at the 2 signatures. Lisa grabbed her phone and started taking photos of the document from multiple angles, zooming in on the forged signature and the witness name. Veronica started talking really fast about how I'd been confused from the medication, and she was just trying to help me get my affairs in order. She said I'd asked her to handle things because I couldn't think clearly. Amy looked back and forth between us with her eyes getting wider and wider as she understood what she was seeing. Her aunt had been planning to take control of everything while her mother was still alive and getting better. I told everyone to sit down because there was more they needed to see. I opened my laptop and pulled up my email account, the one Veronica had been using without permission. Lisa moved closer to read over my shoulder. I scrolled through the sent folder and clicked on message after message. Lisa started reading them out loud. Messages to my clients saying I was entering hospice care and wouldn't be able to continue working with them. Notes to friends saying I didn't want visitors during my final days because I needed peace and quiet. Request to Amy's school asking them to excuse her for bereavement leave in advance. Each email was dated and time-stamped. Lisa read the timestamps out loud. Most of them were sent in the middle of the day when I'd been in the next room working on my laptop or upstairs doing yoga. I'd had no idea my sister was writing my death notices while I was completely unaware just a few feet away. Robert finally found his voice and his hands were shaking when he asked Veronica what the hell she was thinking. The anger in his voice was something I rarely heard from him. Veronica switched tactics immediately and started crying. She said she was just preparing for the worst because she couldn't bear to lose me. Lisa cut her off before she could say more. Lisa pointed out that preparing for the worst doesn't include forging legal documents or stealing $12,000 through GoFundMe, or trying to sell someone's business without their knowledge. I pulled up the GoFundMe page on my laptop and turned the screen so everyone could see it. Amy made a gasping sound when she saw the photos. They were pictures of me at my absolute sickest, taken during my first chemo session when I'd looked my worst. The captions talked about saying goodbye and final expenses, and how the family needed help preparing for what was coming. The page had raised $12,300. I scrolled down through the list of donors. Friends, distant relatives, even some of my clients had donated thinking they were helping my family prepare for my death. Veronica had the money in an account in her name. She started explaining that she was holding it in trust for my final expenses and Amy's future needs. Lisa asked the question I'd been dreading. She asked whether Veronica actually wanted me to die, or was just planning to take over if I did. The silence that followed felt awful. I realized I didn't know the answer, and that uncertainty was almost worse than knowing for sure. Veronica wouldn't look at any of us. She just kept crying and saying she was trying to help, but her actions were louder than any words she could say. Robert told Veronica she needed to leave our house immediately. He said we'd be contacting a lawyer about the forged documents and the stolen GoFundMe money. Veronica looked up with real shock on her face, like she'd expected us to forgive her once she explained herself. She started to argue, but Robert stood up and physically moved between her and me. His protective instinct was finally kicking in after weeks of being manipulated by her fear tactics about my prognosis. Amy suddenly ran upstairs and I heard her bedroom door slam. The sound echoed through all the tension in the room. I wanted to go after her, but I needed to finish this first. I had to make sure Veronica actually left and understood she wasn't welcome back. Lisa stayed close to me like a bodyguard. Her phone was still out and I could see she was recording everything in case we needed evidence later. Veronica stood up and started packing her 2 suitcases with jerky, angry movements. She was muttering about ungrateful family and how she'd sacrificed weeks of her life to help me. She kept trying to make eye contact with Robert, or look upstairs toward Amy's room, searching for an ally. Robert just stood with his arms crossed, waiting for her to leave. When Veronica reached the front door with her suitcases, she turned around. She said I'd regret this when I really did need help, that I was pushing away the only family who cared enough to prepare for reality. I told her the reality was that I wasn't dying. My doctor said my prognosis was excellent. Her reality was a fiction she'd created either for attention or for access to my money. The words came out steady and clear without any of the weakness or confusion she'd been telling everyone I had. Veronica flinched like I'd physically hit her. Then she walked out without saying anything else. Her car pulled away too fast down our quiet street, and I watched through the window until the taillights disappeared. The house felt different the second her car turned the corner, like someone had opened all the windows and let fresh air rush through rooms that had been closed up too long. I turned away from the window and saw Robert sitting on the couch with his head in his hands. His shoulders were shaking, and I realized he was crying. I sat down next to him and he grabbed my hand, saying sorry over and over again for not seeing what was happening sooner. I told him Veronica was good at lying, that she used his fear of losing me to make him blind to what she was really doing, and that we both got played by someone who was probably planning this whole thing since she heard about my diagnosis. He looked up at me with red eyes and asked how I stayed so calm when she was taking over everything. I said I wasn't calm. I was just too tired from chemo to fight back until I found that folder and realized she was actually planning my funeral. Lisa walked into the living room with her phone already out and said she was calling her husband Declan, who does family law stuff. I heard her walk into the kitchen and start explaining everything to him in her calm work voice, the same tone she uses with difficult clients. Then she called the police non-emergency line and asked about filing reports for forgery and fraud. I sat there listening to her handle all the practical steps and felt grateful because I was suddenly so tired I could barely keep my eyes open. The rush of energy that got me through the fight with Veronica was wearing off, and my body was reminding me that I was still recovering from chemo, still fighting cancer even though I was winning. Robert asked if I needed to lie down, but I shook my head because I had to check on Amy first. I went upstairs and knocked on her door, but she didn't answer, so I opened it slowly. She was lying on her bed staring at the ceiling with her face all red and blotchy from crying. She looked at me and asked if I was really okay, or if I was just saying that to make Aunt Veronica leave. I sat on the edge of her bed and pulled out my phone to show her the latest scan results. Dr. Herrera had sent them yesterday with a happy face emoji because the tumor was getting smaller so fast. Amy looked at the images and the numbers, and I watched her face change as she realized I was telling the truth about being okay. She started crying again, but this time it was different, like something heavy was lifting off her chest. She told me she'd been scared for weeks because Veronica kept talking about funeral plans and how Amy would need to be strong for her dad after I was gone. She said she'd been looking up breast cancer survival rates on her phone at night, reading all these awful stories, not knowing that my specific type and stage had way better outcomes than what her aunt was describing. I pulled her into a hug and held her while she cried, getting angry all over again at what Veronica did to my daughter's sense of safety. Amy asked why Aunt Veronica would lie about something so serious, and I said I didn't know. Maybe she was jealous, or maybe she had some kind of mental problem that made her think she was helping when she was actually hurting us. We sat there for a while until Amy's crying slowed down, and she asked if she could keep the scan results on her phone so she could look at them when she got scared. I sent her the images and kissed her forehead before going back downstairs. Lisa was still in the kitchen on the phone, and Robert had moved to the dining room table where he was staring at the forged power of attorney document. That evening, Declan showed up with his laptop and a folder full of legal papers. We sat at the dining room table and he went through everything Veronica did with the kind of careful attention he probably uses in court. He took photos of the forged power of attorney with his phone, making sure to capture the fake signature and the witness name I'd never heard of. Then he had me pull up all the emails on my laptop and he took screenshots of every single one. The ones to my clients saying I was entering hospice, the ones to Amy's school about bereavement leave, all of it. He asked me to write down a timeline of every boundary violation and false statement, starting from the day Veronica arrived with her suitcases. It took almost an hour to write everything down because there was so much. Declan read through my timeline twice and then explained that the forgery was a felony, the GoFundMe was fraud, and the emails sent from my account could be identity theft, depending on how the prosecutor wanted to handle it. He said we had a strong case if we wanted to pursue criminal charges. That night, Declan stayed late working on his laptop at our table while Robert made coffee and I tried to stay awake. He contacted the GoFundMe platform with evidence that the campaign was created without my knowledge using false information about my medical condition. They responded within an hour saying they were freezing the account right away and starting the process of refunding all donations, which would take several weeks but at least stopped Veronica from accessing the money. Declan also wrote a cease and desist letter demanding she have no further contact with me, my family, or my business associates. He read it out loud to make sure I agreed with everything before sending it by email and certified mail. The next morning, I woke up early and started calling clients personally to explain that the emails about me entering hospice were sent without my permission, and that I was actually doing well and continuing to work. Most of them were relieved and supportive, but I could hear the confusion in their voices about how something like this could even happen. Harry McNamara was particularly mad because he'd already started interviewing new consultants based on Veronica's call, wasting time and money on a transition that wasn't necessary. He asked how he could trust that this wouldn't happen again, and I told him honestly that I'd changed all my passwords, and my sister was legally barred from contacting anyone associated with my business. Lisa came over mid-morning and we had a long conversation about the damage to the business and how to rebuild client confidence after Veronica's interference. We decided to send a formal letter to all clients explaining that a family member exceeded her authority and that I remain active in the company with an excellent medical prognosis. Lisa admitted she'd had doubts about the emails because they didn't sound like me, but Veronica had been so convincing on the phone about my declining condition that Lisa had started to believe I was in denial about my health. That hurt to hear, but I understood because Veronica was good at making people believe her version of reality. The police detective assigned to our case called that afternoon and asked me to come in for a formal statement about the forgery and fraud. Robert came with me and we spent 2 hours at the police station going through everything with Detective Moore. He was older, maybe in his 50s, and he said cases like this were more common than people think. Family members who convince themselves they're helping while actually taking control for their own benefit. He explained that prosecution would depend on whether Veronica returned the GoFundMe money and whether I wanted to press charges given that she's family. On the drive home, I struggled with the decision about pressing charges because part of me wanted to believe Veronica was confused rather than mean, that she convinced herself I was dying and was trying to help in her twisted way. But then I remembered the forged signature, the calculations on the asset list, the specific steps she took to keep me away from friends and work, and I realized those weren't the actions of someone who was confused. Those were the actions of someone executing a plan. The next morning, Dr. Herrera called my cell phone directly instead of having her office contact me. She asked if I was okay, and if I'd heard that someone was telling people in the medical community I was terminal. I explained the whole situation with Veronica, and she went quiet for a long moment before saying she was horrified. She offered to write up documentation of my actual prognosis and treatment response that I could use however I needed. Then she mentioned something that made my stomach drop. Veronica had called her office twice trying to get information about my condition. She'd claimed to be my medical power of attorney and demanded copies of my records and test results. The staff had correctly refused to share anything without my explicit written consent. Herrera said she was calling to make sure I knew about the attempts and to ask if I wanted to file a complaint with the medical board. I thanked her and said I'd think about it. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table staring at my phone and wondering what else Veronica had tried that I didn't know about yet. What other calls had she made using my name? What other forms had she submitted with my information? The thought of all the places she might have reached out to made me feel sick. I spent that entire afternoon making calls. First, my bank to check for any unusual activity or attempts to add authorized users to my accounts. The representative put me on hold for several minutes, then came back saying everything looked normal. Then I called my credit card companies one by one and asked the same questions. Two of them flagged recent inquiries on my credit report that I hadn't made, but they were just inquiries, not actual applications. My insurance company was the one that found something. The representative asked me to hold while she checked my recent claims, and when she came back, her voice had changed to something more serious. Someone had tried to submit a claim for hospice care under my policy. The claim had been rejected automatically because it didn't match my actual treatment plan on file. They'd flagged it as potential fraud and opened an investigation. She asked if I knew who might have submitted it, and I told her it was probably my sister who'd been staying with me. She said I should file a police report and gave me a case number for their fraud investigation. I added it to the growing file Declan was building. 3 days after Veronica left, I got a call from an unknown number that turned out to be her husband. He asked what happened and said Veronica had come home hysterical, claiming I'd turned the whole family against her. His voice sounded tired and confused. I took a deep breath and explained calmly what she'd actually done. The forged power of attorney document with my signature faked on it. The GoFundMe she'd created without my knowledge using my worst chemo photos. The emails she'd sent from my account telling my clients and Amy's school that I was dying. The lies she'd told my daughter about funeral arrangements while I was in the next room working. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, he admitted something I hadn't expected. Veronica had been obsessed with my success for years. She brought up my consulting firm constantly at home. She compared their financial situation to ours in ways that made him uncomfortable. She'd track my business wins through mutual acquaintances and social media, and then spiral into days of anger and resentment. He said he'd tried to get her to see a therapist about it, but she'd refused. Then he told me something that made my hands go cold. Veronica had been planning this trip for weeks before my diagnosis. She'd been talking about how she needed to reconnect with family, about how it wasn't fair that I had so much when she'd sacrificed her career to stay home with kids. When she heard about the cancer through our cousin, he said her whole mood shifted. She saw it as an opportunity rather than a tragedy. A chance to finally be the important one. A chance to maybe get access to resources she felt she deserved. He apologized 3 times in a row. He promised he'd make sure she returned every penny of the GoFundMe money. He said he was horrified by what she'd done. I hung up feeling worse than before the call because now I knew this wasn't just about confused caregiving or denial about my prognosis. This was premeditated. She'd been waiting for an opportunity to insert herself into my life and take control. The GoFundMe refunds started processing over the next week, and I received messages from donors expressing shock and anger that they'd been deceived. Some were understanding and just glad I was actually okay, but others felt betrayed and manipulated. One woman wrote that she'd donated her grocery money for the week because the photos of me looked so terrible, and the description said I had days left. She felt like Veronica had used her compassion as a weapon. A former client wrote that he'd shared the campaign with his whole company, and now felt embarrassed that he'd asked colleagues to donate to something fraudulent. I responded to each message personally. I apologized for my sister's actions. I thanked them for their intended kindness. I felt embarrassed that my family drama had become their problem. Some people didn't respond, but others wrote back with their own stories of family members who'd taken advantage during illness or crisis. It helped a little to know I wasn't alone in dealing with this kind of manipulation. Amy started seeing a counselor at the school to process the fear and confusion of the past 3 weeks. I was grateful her school had resources to help her work through what happened. The counselor called me after the first session and asked if we could talk. She said Amy had been carrying tremendous anxiety about losing me. The anxiety had been made worse by Veronica's constant death preparation and funeral planning. Amy had been researching my type of cancer at night on her phone, reading worst-case scenarios. She'd been afraid to tell me how scared she was because she didn't want to make me feel worse. The counselor said it would take time to rebuild Amy's sense of security, that we needed to have regular, open conversations about my health and treatment, that Amy needed to see me living normally, not just hear me say I was fine. I felt guilty that I hadn't protected her better from Veronica's manipulation. I'd been too sick and tired during those first weeks to see how much damage was being done to my daughter's mental health. Robert and I had several difficult conversations over the next few days about how he'd failed to protect me when Veronica was taking over our lives. We'd sit at the kitchen table after Amy went to bed, and I'd ask him questions I'd been holding in. Why did he let her answer my phone? Why did he believe her version of my health over what I was telling him? Why didn't he question the funeral planning or the asset lists or the emails to my clients? He admitted he'd been paralyzed by fear of my death. When Veronica showed up confident and certain about what needed to happen, he'd grabbed onto that certainty like it was saving him from drowning. He'd wanted someone to tell him what to do and how to prepare, because the uncertainty of cancer was unbearable. He said he knew I was getting better, but part of him couldn't believe it, couldn't trust it. So when Veronica painted this picture of decline and limited time, some part of him believed her because believing the worst felt safer than hoping for the best. I understood the fear, but I was also angry. Angry that he'd believed her narrative over my actual lived experience. Angry that he'd let her answer my phone and make decisions without questioning whether I wanted that help. Angry that he'd been so focused on preparing for my death that he'd missed me fighting to stay alive. We started couples counseling the following week to work through the trust issues created by his failure to intervene and my anger at being erased in my own home. The therapist was a woman in her 60s who'd worked with cancer families before. She helped us see how Veronica had exploited normal dynamics that happen when someone gets seriously ill, how caregivers often feel helpless and can be vulnerable to someone who appears confident and in control, how the patient can be too sick or overwhelmed to advocate for themselves effectively. How family systems can get hijacked by the person who seems most certain, even when that certainty is based on lies. Robert committed to being more present and questioning going forward, to trusting my assessment of my own condition rather than someone else's dire predictions, to checking in with me before making decisions that affected my life. The therapist gave us homework about communication and boundary setting that felt awkward at first, but started to help. Lisa and I met with Harry McNamara in person to repair the client relationship. We brought documentation of my treatment progress and Dr. Herrera's written statement about my excellent prognosis. We met at his office downtown, and I could tell he was skeptical when we walked in. Lisa did most of the talking at first, explaining what had happened with Veronica and showing him the timeline of her interference. I added details about the forged documents and the fraud investigation. Harry listened without interrupting, and then asked to see the medical documentation. He read Dr. Herrera's letter carefully. It stated clearly that my cancer had responded well to treatment, that the tumor was shrinking, that my prognosis was excellent for long-term survival. He softened as he read it. He said he understood that Veronica had been acting without any authority, but he also said we needed to rebuild trust through consistent performance over time. He'd keep working with us, but he expected regular updates and transparency about my health and availability. It was fair and exactly what I intended to do. We shook hands, and I felt like I'd gotten back something important that Veronica had tried to take away. 2 weeks after the confrontation, an unexpected deposit appeared in my bank account, $12,300. The note attached said it was from the GoFundMe and their personal savings to cover what Veronica had already spent from the campaign. Veronica's husband had included another apology. He asked that I not press criminal charges because it would devastate their family. He said Veronica was seeking therapy for what he called her control issues and jealousy problems. He promised she'd never contact me or my family again. I appreciated the money being returned, but I wasn't ready to decide about charges yet. Part of me wanted to let it go now that the money was back and she was getting help. But another part remembered the forged signature and the calculated planning and thought she should face real consequences for what she'd done. I called Declan the next morning and asked if we could meet to talk about my options. He came over that afternoon with his laptop and a legal pad, sitting at my kitchen table while Robert made coffee. Declan explained that I had real leverage now because the money was back, and Veronica was clearly scared about prosecution. He said we could draft an agreement that protected me without necessarily going through criminal charges, something that would keep her away and require her to get help. We spent 2 hours working through the terms. The agreement would require Veronica to stay away from me and my family completely. No contact at all. She'd have to complete therapy with a licensed psychologist and provide proof she was going. She couldn't contact any of my business associates or clients ever again. And she had to sign a statement admitting everything she did, the forgery and fraud and unauthorized communications, so I'd have it on record if I needed it later. The key part was that if she broke any of these rules, I kept the right to pursue all criminal charges. Declan said this gave me protection while avoiding the stress of a trial, and I could always change my mind if she violated the agreement. 3 days later, Veronica's husband called. His voice sounded tired and sad when he said Veronica would sign the agreement. He told me she'd already started therapy, and her psychologist thought she had some kind of personality disorder related to competition and control. He said it got triggered by my success, and her feeling like a failure. I could hear the exhaustion in every word, like he'd been dealing with this for years and was finally seeing it clearly. He asked if there was any chance we could make up someday, maybe in a few years when she'd gotten more help. I told him honestly that I didn't think so. What she did crossed too many lines and destroyed what little family connection we had left. She didn't just try to help and go too far. She forged my signature. She planned my funeral while I was getting better. She tried to steal my business and my money. Those weren't mistakes or confusion. Those were choices she made over and over for weeks. He was quiet for a long time and then said he understood. I felt a little sorry for him being married to someone capable of what Veronica did, but mostly I just felt relieved that this part was ending. The signed agreement arrived by courier the following week. Everything was notarized and complete, with Veronica's signature on every page. There was a letter with it that read like something her lawyer wrote instead of a real apology. She admitted to the forgery and fraud and unauthorized communications. She stated that she had no right to make medical or financial decisions for me. She agreed to all the terms about staying away. At the very end was one line saying she hoped I recovered fully. It felt empty given that she'd been planning my funeral while I was recovering just fine. I filed the agreement in my safe and tried to put the whole thing behind me. Getting back to normal life took more effort than I expected. I worked full days on my consulting projects, drove Amy to the school and activities, kept going to my chemo treatments. My hair started growing back in soft curls that looked nothing like my original straight hair. I kind of loved the change. It made me feel like a different version of myself, someone who'd survived something hard. Dr. Herrera checked my progress every 2 weeks and kept saying the tumor was shrinking. She told me if this kept going well, I'd move to maintenance treatment soon with a really good long-term outlook. I started believing her instead of Veronica's death predictions. My body was proving every day that I wasn't dying. Lisa called me one afternoon with news about a major new client. They'd specifically chosen our firm because they heard how we handled the crisis with Veronica's interference. They saw it as proof of our honesty and strength. Lisa was laughing when she told me, saying the irony was incredible. Veronica tried to destroy my business and instead demonstrated exactly the qualities that attracted new work. We met for lunch at our favorite restaurant to celebrate. Lisa raised her glass and joked that we should send Veronica a thank you card for the accidental marketing. I almost choked on my wine laughing. It felt good to find humor in something that had been so awful. Amy's counselor called to give me an update. She said Amy was making good progress working through her fears and learning to trust information about my health again. That same evening, Amy came into my room and asked if she could come to one of my chemo sessions. She wanted to see for herself that it wasn't the death sentence her aunt made it sound like. She wanted to watch me actually getting treatment that was working. I checked with Dr. Herrera, who said it was totally fine. The next week, Amy sat with me during the infusion. She asked questions about the medicines and the machines. She watched me read a book and answer work emails like it was no big deal. I could see her relax as she realized this was just medical treatment, not some terrible final stage. On the drive home, she said she felt better knowing what it really looked like instead of imagining the worst. Robert surprised me by planning a weekend trip to the beach. We'd canceled it after my diagnosis because Veronica had convinced him I was too sick to travel. He rented a small house right on the sand, and we spent 3 days walking on the beach, eating fresh seafood and pretending cancer didn't exist for a little while. Amy built this huge sandcastle and decorated it with shells she collected. I took a photo of her kneeling next to it with the ocean behind her, smiling and looking young and happy. I knew I'd keep that photo forever because it captured her being carefree again, instead of scared and sad about losing someone who wasn't even dying. I started reconnecting with friends who Veronica had told I didn't want visitors. I called each one and explained what happened, apologizing for the confusion. Most were understanding and horrified by what my sister did. But a few admitted they weren't sure they would have questioned it if they'd been in Robert's position. They said cancer is scary, and people want to trust family members who seem confident. Their honesty actually helped me have more compassion for Robert's failure to see through Veronica's manipulation. I was still working through my anger about it in therapy, but I could understand better how it happened. 3 months after Veronica left, Dr. Herrera called me into her office with Robert, Amy, and Lisa. She pulled up my latest scans on the computer screen and smiled. She said the cancer was no longer detectable. I was in remission. I'd need continued monitoring and maintenance treatment, but the cancer was gone. We all started crying right there in her office, happy tears that felt like relief pouring out. In the parking lot afterward, we stood in a circle hugging and crying some more. I thought about how Veronica had been planning my funeral during the same treatment period that was actually saving my life. The difference between her dark fantasy and this bright reality felt huge and important. I decided to write everything down in a detailed account and share it with our extended family. Not for drama, but because I wanted the truth on record in case Veronica tried to rewrite history later. I sent it to about 20 cousins and aunts and uncles. Several responded with shock and support, saying they couldn't believe Veronica would do something like that. But a few took Veronica's side. They said I was being too harsh on someone who was just trying to help. They said family should forgive family. The divided responses showed me that Veronica's manipulation worked on more people than just Robert. Her performance of devoted sister caring for dying sibling was convincing to those who wanted to believe in family loyalty. But I had the truth documented now, and that was what mattered. A few days later, my cousin Rachel called and said she needed to tell me something that had been bothering her since she read my account. She explained that about 6 months before my diagnosis, Veronica had reached out to her asking really detailed questions about my business and finances. Veronica had claimed she was thinking about starting her own consulting firm and wanted advice since Rachel worked in corporate finance. Rachel walked me through the specific questions Veronica had asked, things about business valuations, partnership structures, how to determine what someone's stake in a company was worth, what assets typically got included in estate planning. At the time, Rachel thought it was weird because Veronica had never shown interest in business before, and the questions seemed oddly specific to my situation, rather than general consulting work. But she figured maybe Veronica was just using my success as a reference point and didn't think much more about it. Now, after reading what happened, Rachel realized Veronica had been researching how to take over my business and assets months before I even got sick. The cancer diagnosis just gave her the opportunity to execute whatever plan she'd already been working on. I thanked Rachel for telling me and sat there feeling cold, as I understood this wasn't some confused reaction to my illness. Veronica had been planning something all along, and my cancer just became her excuse to make it happen. I called Declan and told him about Rachel's information. He was quiet for a minute, then asked if I'd ever checked whether Veronica tried to take out life insurance on me. The question made my stomach drop because I hadn't even thought of that, but it made horrible sense given everything else she'd done. He explained that with the forged power of attorney and her level of planning, it was possible she'd tried to set up policies that would pay out to her if I died. I called my insurance agent that afternoon and explained the situation, asking him to check if anyone had inquired about policies on me recently. He said he'd investigate and call me back. 2 days later, he called with information that made me feel sick. Veronica had contacted the company about adding a life insurance policy on me, claiming she had power of attorney and was helping me get my affairs in order during my cancer treatment. She'd asked about a policy worth $500,000 with herself listed as the main person who would get the money. The insurance company had told her they needed my direct signature and medical exam for a policy that size, especially given my cancer diagnosis. She'd said she'd get back to them with the paperwork, but never followed through. My agent said they'd flagged it as suspicious at the time because the person requesting the policy wasn't the person being insured, but since nothing came of it, they'd just made a note in my file. Hearing this information made everything click into place in the worst way. Veronica hadn't just been planning to control my medical decisions and take over my business. She'd been thinking about the financial benefit of my death. The life insurance inquiry combined with the funeral planning and the forged documents painted a picture that was darker than I'd wanted to believe. I immediately called Detective Moore and told him about both pieces of new information: Rachel's call about the pre-diagnosis financial questions and the life insurance inquiry. He asked me to come in and make a supplemental statement, saying this evidence significantly strengthened the case if I decided to pursue charges. I went to the police station that afternoon and walked him through everything. Detective Moore explained that the life insurance attempt combined with the forged power of attorney showed clear planning and financial motivation, rather than just confused caregiving or denial about my prognosis. He said prosecutors loved cases with this kind of evidence trail because it demonstrated intent and premeditation. Then he leaned back in his chair and said he understood this was my sister and family prosecutions were complicated, but I should remember that Veronica's actions were serious crimes that could happen to someone else if she faced no consequences. He told me to take the time I needed to decide, but to remember that the evidence was solid, and the behavior was criminal regardless of family ties. I told him I appreciated his patience, that I was still processing everything and needed to focus on my health right now. He nodded and said the case would stay open, and I could move forward with charges whenever I was ready. That evening, Amy came into my room and sat on the edge of my bed looking upset. She asked me why Aunt Veronica hated me so much, what I'd done to make her want to hurt our family like that. I pulled her close and tried to explain something I was still working through myself. I told her I didn't think it was really hate, that it was probably more like envy mixed with some kind of mental health problem that made Veronica lose track of right and wrong. I explained that sometimes people who feel like failures in their own lives become obsessed with people they think have everything they want. That obsession can turn toxic and make them do terrible things while convincing themselves they're actually helping, or that they deserve what the other person has. I told Amy that Veronica had always resented my career success and the life Robert and I built, that she'd made it clear 15 years ago she thought I was a bad mother for working instead of staying home. My cancer probably felt like proof to her that she'd been right all along, that my choices had led to punishment, and maybe that gave her permission in her mind to take over and claim what she thought should have been hers. Amy was quiet for a while, then said she never wanted to see Veronica again. I told her I didn't blame her for feeling that way, and that I felt the same, though I added that she might feel differently when she was older, and had more distance from what happened. She shook her head firmly and said some things were too wrong to forgive, that what Veronica did to our family wasn't just mean, but evil. I didn't argue with her because part of me agreed. A week later, Robert got a call from Veronica's husband. He put it on speaker so I could hear. Veronica's husband explained that she'd been seeing a therapist since leaving our house, and had just been diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. The therapist apparently believed Veronica had experienced some kind of break where she'd convinced herself she was saving the family by taking control of my life and affairs. He said Veronica was devastated by the separation from family, and claimed she never meant to hurt anyone, that she truly believed she was helping prepare for the inevitable. Then he asked if there was any path to reconciliation, if we could consider family therapy together, or at least allow Veronica to apologize in person. Robert's voice was firm when he answered. He said reconciliation wasn't possible, that a mental health diagnosis didn't erase the damage Veronica had done or the crimes she'd committed. He explained that we needed to protect our family from future harm, and that meant keeping Veronica completely out of our lives. He told Veronica's husband we wished them well, but there was no relationship to repair because Veronica had destroyed whatever family connection existed. After the call ended, we sat in silence for a few minutes. I felt relief that Robert was standing firm, but also a weird sadness that it had come to this, that my sister had become someone we needed protection from. The next week, I had my last scheduled chemotherapy treatment. Lisa and Amy came with me to the cancer center, and we made it a celebration instead of a sad occasion. The nurses who'd been taking care of me for months brought in a certificate of completion they'd made with my name decorated in glitter. They took photos of me holding it and gave me a small bell to ring that they said all their patients rang when finishing treatment. Dr. Herrera came in during the final infusion and sat down to talk about what came next. She pulled up my latest scans on her tablet and showed us how much the tumor had shrunk, how well my body had responded to the treatment. She explained the monitoring schedule going forward, appointments every 3 months for the first year, then spreading out if everything stayed clear. She emphasized that my outcome was exactly what they hoped for with early-stage breast cancer, that I'd done everything right, and my prognosis was excellent. Walking out of the cancer center that day, I felt lighter than I had in months, like I was finally stepping back into my real life instead of living in cancer world. Lisa took Amy and me out for lunch at my favorite restaurant, and we toasted with fancy drinks to being done with chemo. Amy asked if my hair would grow back the same, and I told her probably not, that I'd heard it often came back different. She said she hoped I'd get curls because that would be cool. Back at work, Lisa and I realized we needed help managing all our clients. Despite everything Veronica had tried to do to destroy the business, we'd actually gained accounts during my treatment. The clients who stuck with us through the crisis seemed more loyal than before, and several new ones had signed on specifically because they'd heard how we handled the situation. We interviewed candidates for a new consultant position and hired someone within 2 weeks. As I trained the new person and reviewed our client list, I understood the business was actually stronger now than before my diagnosis. We were more organized because we'd had to be during my treatment. Our client relationships were deeper because we'd weathered a crisis together. and my whole perspective on work had shifted in a way that made me better at my job. I was grateful for the success, but also more balanced about it, less willing to sacrifice family time for professional achievement the way I might have before. Amy's report card came home with improved grades in every subject. Her school counselor called to say Amy had developed really good coping strategies for managing her worry about my health. We set up a new system at home where Amy could ask me directly about any medical concerns, instead of imagining worst-case scenarios alone. I promised to be completely honest with her about how I was feeling, to share my scan results and doctor's reports so she wouldn't have to wonder or worry in secret. One night she told me she was proud of how I'd stood up to Aunt Veronica and didn't let her take over our lives. She said it taught her about setting boundaries with people who claim they're helping, but are actually hurting you. I hugged her and told her that was a lesson I was still learning myself, but I was glad something good came from the awful situation. Robert and I finished our couples counseling with a final session where our therapist said she was impressed by the work we'd done. We'd spent months working through the trust issues from his failure to protect me from Veronica's manipulation and my anger at being erased in my own home. The therapist explained that we'd done the hard work of really examining our relationship instead of just trying to get back to how things were before. Robert was more confident now in supporting me without taking over, and I was better at asking for help when I needed it instead of trying to handle everything alone. We'd established new communication patterns for handling future crises, ways of checking in with each other that we should have had all along. Driving home from that last session, Robert reached over and took my hand. He said he was grateful we'd fought for our marriage instead of letting Veronica's interference break us apart. I agreed and felt hopeful about our future in a way I hadn't in years. A letter arrived from one of my clients that made me stop and read it twice. They thanked me for my integrity in handling the situation with Veronica, and said it reinforced their decision to work with our firm. The letter explained that they'd lost a family member to cancer a few years ago, and had been devastated when they received the emails about me entering hospice care. Learning the truth was a relief, but also a reminder of how precious life is, and how important it is to work with people you can trust. Their words made me think about all the ripples from Veronica's lies. How many people had been affected beyond just my immediate family? Friends who'd grieved for me unnecessarily, clients who'd scrambled to find new consultants, donors to the GoFundMe who'd been manipulated into giving money for fake final expenses, Amy's teachers who'd prepared for a student losing her mother. All those people had been touched by Veronica's deception in ways I was still discovering, but they'd also seen me stand up and reclaim my truth, which maybe meant something too. 6 months after my diagnosis, I was healthy and working full-time again. The scans came back clean, showing no cancer. I had gained back the weight I lost during chemo, and my hair was growing in thick and curly instead of the straight hair I used to have. I ran 3 miles most mornings and did yoga in the evenings. When I looked in the mirror, I saw someone different from before. Someone who had survived cancer and a sister who tried to take over her life. Someone who fought on 2 fronts and won both battles. The experience changed me in ways I was still figuring out. I was fiercer now about protecting what mattered, less willing to put up with people who drained energy instead of adding something good to my life. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Veronica's husband sent it with a short note saying Veronica wanted to talk. The letter itself was 2 pages of her explaining that she had made progress in therapy, that she understood now what she had done wrong, that she wanted to apologize in person, and maybe start rebuilding our relationship. I read it twice, then put it in a drawer. That Thursday, I brought it to my therapy session and showed my therapist. She read it carefully, then asked me what I wanted to do. I said I didn't know. She told me I should only consider meeting Veronica if I wanted closure for myself. Not because I felt obligated to accept her apology. Not to help Veronica feel better about what she did. Only if it would actually help me move forward. I thought about it for a whole week. Went running and thought about it. Cooked dinner and thought about it. Lay awake at night thinking about it. By the next Thursday, I knew my answer. I didn't want to see her. I had closure already from reclaiming my life. I didn't need her apology to move forward. I was already moving forward just fine without her. Robert called Veronica's husband on Friday evening. I sat next to him on the couch while he explained our decision. He said we wished Veronica well in her therapy, but we weren't interested in rebuilding a relationship. The husband was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he understood. That he was sad, but he respected our boundary. That maybe in a few years there might be a chance. But he understood we needed space now. Robert thanked him for being respectful and ended the call. I felt this wave of relief wash over me. Like I had been holding a door half open waiting to see if Veronica would push through. Now the door was finally closed all the way. I could stop wondering when or if she might show up again. Stop bracing myself for another attempt to take control. The decision was made and I felt lighter for it. 2 weeks later, Lisa called me excited about an invitation we had received. A women's business conference wanted us to speak about resilience and crisis management. Lisa thought we should share what happened with Veronica as a case study in protecting your business during personal challenges. I was nervous about telling the story publicly, but Lisa convinced me it could help other women. We spent a week preparing our presentation, making slides about the warning signs we missed, the steps we took to regain control, the legal protections we put in place. The day of the conference, we stood on stage in front of 200 women and told them everything. How my sister had systematically tried to take over my life and business while I was fighting cancer. How we fought back with evidence and legal action. How we protected our company and came out stronger. The response was overwhelming. During the question period, dozens of hands shot up. After we finished speaking, at least 20 women came up to us. They shared their own stories of family members who tried to take advantage during illness or crisis, sisters who stole inheritance, brothers who manipulated elderly parents, cousins who swooped in during divorces. I realized Veronica's behavior was an extreme version of something many people face, that pattern of family members who use crisis as an opportunity for control or money. It made me feel less alone in what I had experienced. That evening, Amy told me about something she wanted to do. She had been talking to her school counselor about volunteering with a teen support group, kids whose parents have cancer. She wanted to use her experience to help others who were scared and confused. I asked her why, and she said it helped her process what she went through. That talking to other kids who understood made her feel less weird about her feelings. That making something positive out of the fear and manipulation she experienced with Veronica felt important. She had already signed up, and her first session was next week. I hugged her and told her I was proud of her. Proud that she chose to help others instead of staying bitter about what happened. She smiled and said her counselor told her that helping others was a good way to heal yourself too. The next Sunday, I announced a new family tradition at dinner. From now on, we would have a family dinner together once a month. Robert and Amy and I would cook the meal together. No phones allowed. No work talk unless someone really wanted to share something. Just us talking about our lives and being together. Amy immediately started planning the menu for next month. She wanted to make homemade pizza with 3 different toppings. Robert said he would handle dessert. We spent that evening cooking pasta together and talking about everything and nothing. Amy told us about drama at the school. Robert shared a funny story from work. I talked about the conference and how good it felt to share our story. Near the end of dinner, Amy made a joke that Aunt Veronica accidentally gave us a gift. She made us appreciate each other more. Made us realize how solid we were as a family unit. Robert and I looked at each other and smiled. Amy was right. That was probably the only positive thing that came from Veronica's interference. We had survived a crisis and come out stronger on the other side. My appointment with Dr. Herrera the following week brought more good news. She reviewed my latest scans and blood work. Everything looked great. She said my continued good health meant we could reduce my monitoring appointments. Instead of coming in every month, I would only need to come every 3 months. She reminded me I would need to stay careful about follow-up care for years to come. That breast cancer survivors need long-term monitoring. But the immediate crisis was over. I should focus on living my life fully, instead of thinking of myself as a cancer patient. I left her office feeling different. Like I had graduated from something. Moved from cancer patient to cancer survivor. It was a small shift in how I thought about myself, but it mattered. I wasn't fighting cancer anymore. I had fought it and won. Now I was just living my life and staying healthy. The next day, I called the housekeeper Veronica had fired. I apologized for the confusion and offered to pay her for the weeks of work she lost. She was kind about it. Said she had wondered why I would suddenly fire her after years of good service. She had assumed it was related to my illness, that maybe I couldn't afford her anymore or needed the house quiet. I explained what really happened, and she was shocked. She agreed to come back, and we set up her regular schedule again. Having her back felt like another piece of normal life being restored. Another way Veronica's changes were being undone. My house felt like mine again with my routines and my choices. That Friday, Robert surprised me when I got home from work. He had packed bags for both of us and made reservations at a bed and breakfast in wine country to celebrate my 6-month remission milestone. We drove up Saturday morning and spent 2 days tasting wine and eating amazing food. We walked through vineyards and sat on the porch watching the sunset. We talked about our future plans now that cancer wasn't taking up all our mental space. Robert wanted to travel more. I wanted to expand the business. We both wanted to spend more time with Amy before she left for college. On Sunday evening, sitting on that porch, Robert took my hand. He said he was grateful for a second chance to be the partner I deserved during the crisis, that he wouldn't take for granted again how strong I was, that he wouldn't let anyone else diminish me the way Veronica tried to do. I squeezed his hand and told him I was grateful too. Grateful we fought for our marriage instead of letting the crisis break us apart. The following Tuesday, I met with Declan to make my final decision about pressing criminal charges against Veronica. I had been thinking about it for months, going back and forth. Part of me wanted her to face consequences. Part of me just wanted to move on. Declan laid out my options again. The forgery was a felony. The fraud was prosecutable. But pursuing charges would mean months of legal proceedings, depositions and court dates, keeping Veronica in my life through the justice system. I thought about what I really wanted. What would actually make me feel better. I decided I didn't want to press charges. The civil agreement we had was enough. She had returned the money. She was in therapy. She had signed documents admitting what she did. If she violated the agreement or contacted us, I could always change my mind. But for now, I wanted to move forward without that weight. Declan supported my decision. He made sure I understood I could always file charges later if I needed to. That the evidence was documented and preserved. I signed the papers closing the case and felt at peace with my choice. Pursuing prosecution would keep me tied to Veronica's drama. I wanted to move forward with my life instead. 2 months after signing the agreement with Declan, Lisa called me into her office with a huge smile on her face. She had the quarterly financial report spread across her desk, and the numbers were better than anything we had seen in 5 years. Our revenue was up 40% from the previous quarter. We had landed 3 major new clients in the past 8 weeks. 2 of our existing clients had expanded their contracts. The business was not just surviving my cancer treatment. It was actually growing faster than before my diagnosis. Lisa said clients kept telling her they were impressed by how we handled the crisis with Veronica. They saw it as proof that we could manage difficult situations with honesty and professionalism. We spent an hour going through the numbers and talking about what this growth meant for the company. We needed help to handle all the new work. Lisa had already been interviewing candidates for a second additional consultant position. We made the decision to hire 2 people instead of 1 and start looking for a larger office space. I sat in her office looking at those financial reports and felt amazed that Veronica's attempt to destroy what I had built had somehow made the company stronger. Her lies to clients had forced us to communicate more directly with everyone. Her interference had shown people our true character. The business I had spent 15 years building was thriving in ways I had not imagined possible. A week later, Amy came home from the school waving an envelope with a fancy letterhead. She had been accepted into a competitive summer program at the state university for high school students interested in psychology and counseling. Only 30 students from across the state got selected each year. The program included workshops with professional therapists, volunteer opportunities at mental health organizations, and college credit that would transfer to most universities. Amy sat at the kitchen table explaining why she had applied without telling me. She said her own therapy sessions after everything with Veronica had shown her how important it was to have someone who really listens and helps you understand confusing situations. Her volunteer work with the teen support group at the school had made her realize she wanted to help other people going through hard times. She told me that watching me fight cancer while also dealing with Aunt Veronica's manipulation had taught her that sometimes the hardest battles are not the obvious ones. She wanted to learn how to help people recognize when someone is controlling them while pretending to care. I hugged her and told her I was so proud of how she had taken something painful and turned it into purpose. She had every right to be angry and bitter about what Veronica put our family through. Instead, she was using that experience to build skills that would help other people. That same week, Robert came home early from work with news about a promotion. His company was moving him into a senior management role that would require much less travel. Instead of being on the road 3 weeks out of every month, he would work from the main office and only travel for important client meetings maybe twice a month. He had actually negotiated for this change as part of accepting the promotion. He told me that being away during my diagnosis had made him realize he was missing too much of our daily lives. He said Veronica's manipulation had worked partly because he was not around enough to see what was really happening in our house. The reduced travel felt like another positive thing that came from surviving the crisis. Our family priorities had shifted in ways that made us stronger and more connected. The following Saturday, I attended a breast cancer survivor celebration event at the Cancer Center, where I had received my treatment. The event brought together women at all different stages of their cancer journeys. Some were newly diagnosed and just starting treatment. Others were 5 or 10 years past their final chemo session. I walked around the room listening to their stories and feeling grateful that my cancer had been caught early and responded so well to treatment. I also realized how unusual my experience with Veronica had been. Most of these women talked about families who supported them with genuine love and care. They had spouses who took them to appointments and held their hands during scary test results. They had sisters who brought meals and watched their kids and respected their boundaries. When I carefully shared my story about Veronica, several women looked shocked and said they could not imagine dealing with that kind of manipulation on top of fighting cancer. One woman told me that what Veronica did was a form of abuse, using my vulnerability to take control of my life. Another said she was amazed I had the strength to fight back while going through chemo. Their reactions validated what I had known but sometimes doubted. Veronica's behavior was not normal family help. It was wrong and harmful, and I had been right to stop it. 1 year after the doctor said stage 2 breast cancer, I sat in Dr. Herrera's office looking at completely clear scans. No cancer detected anywhere in my body. My hair had grown back thick and healthy. My energy levels were normal. I was working full-time and exercising regularly. Dr. Herrera smiled and said my outcome was exactly what they hoped for with early detection and good treatment response. I was officially a cancer survivor now, not a cancer patient. I drove home thinking about everything that had happened in that year. I had learned to set fierce boundaries with people who claimed to help, but actually tried to control. I had learned to trust my own understanding of my situation, instead of someone else's scary predictions. I had learned to value the people who supported me with real love, instead of manipulation. Veronica had tried to erase me and take over my life while I was sick and vulnerable. She had failed completely. My business was more successful than ever. My marriage was stronger after working through the crisis together. My daughter had grown resilient and purposeful. I had built something better from the wreckage Veronica tried to create. That evening, I sat in my home office working on. I was here in my office working on projects I cared about, parenting a daughter I was proud of, married to a husband who had learned to be present and supportive. I was living my life fully in all the ways Veronica had tried to prevent but could not stop.